For most of his career, Colin Firth was the picture of British composure. The clenched jaw, the restrained smile, the sense that whatever storm was happening underneath, the surface would never crack. That image made him one of the most respected actors of his generation. It also meant that when his life actually did fall apart, almost no one saw it coming, because the man built his entire public identity on not letting anyone see anything at all. The unraveling did not begin with headlines. It began quietly, inside a marriage that had lasted more than 2 decades. Firth married Italian filmmaker and producer Livia Gigioli in 1997, a year after they met on the set of a television production in Italy. Together, they built a life that spanned 2 countries, a home in London and another in Umbria, and raised 2 sons, Luca and Matteo. For years, that partnership was treated in the press almost as a fixed point, a rare Hollywood marriage that seemed to actually work. Firth spoke about Umbria, about sustainability, about Livia's environmental projects, in a way that suggested the marriage was as much a shared cause as a romance. That image cracked between 2015 and 2016, when Firth and Gigioli went through a private separation. During that period, Gigioli became involved with an Italian journalist named Marco Brancaccia, someone she had known since childhood. The couple later reconciled, but the story did not end there. In 2018, it emerged that the Firths had filed a stalking complaint against Brancaccia, accusing him of harassing Gigioli after their relationship ended. Brancaccia denied the stalking claim entirely. He told reporters the two had genuinely been involved, that Gigioli had wanted to leave Firth for him, and that what the couple was calling stalking amounted to a couple of messages and one regretted email to Colin himself. The dispute became public only because a court document was leaked to an Italian newspaper, forcing the family to respond to something they had spent years trying to keep private. By July of that year, both sides reached a private settlement, and the lawyers involved asked, pointedly, that no further public statements be made. That request for silence tells you something about how Firth handled the whole ordeal. There was no press tour of grievance, no tell-all interview, no attempt to control the narrative through media appearances. He simply absorbed the story as it played out in the press, and kept working. Then, in December 2019, came the announcement that the marriage itself was ending. A representative confirmed that Firth and Gigioli had separated after 22 years together, describing them as remaining close friends who were united in their commitment to their children. There was no bitterness in the statement, no blame assigned. It was, by all appearances, the same restraint Firth had shown throughout the Brancaccia affair, now applied to the end of his marriage. It is worth pausing on what that divorce actually meant for him, beyond the headline. This was not simply a romantic breakup. It was the dismantling of an identity Firth had spent more than 20 years building, one where his personal life and public image were deeply intertwined with Umbria, with Livia's advocacy work, with the sense of a partnership that crossed cultures. The divorce, finalized in 2021, arrived in the middle of a global pandemic, a period when film productions had slowed to a crawl and the normal rhythms of an acting career, premieres, festivals, press tours, simply stopped existing. Whatever a person might have used to distract themselves from a major life change was largely unavailable in 2020 and 2021. Professionally, this personal upheaval landed at an already difficult moment in Firth's career. He had reached what should have been the peak of his standing in the industry in 2011, when he won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance as King George VI in The King's Speech. It was the kind of performance, quiet, layered, deeply controlled, that critics had been waiting for him to deliver for years, the confirmation that he was not simply a charming leading man, but a genuinely formidable actor. But an Oscar win does not freeze an actor's position in the industry. As Firth moved into his 60s, the type of role Hollywood was willing to build a film around shifted away from him, as it does for most actors his age. The romantic leads and award-season dramas that once came to him easily, increasingly, went to younger performers. What was offered to him instead were roles as mentors, fathers, and authority figures, respectable work, but rarely the emotional center of a story. The Kingsman franchise became one of his most consistent professional homes during this period, casting him as a refined spy whose calm exterior hides considerable skill and violence. The films were commercially successful and widely seen, but they belonged to the category of stylish entertainment rather than the kind of prestige drama that shapes an actor's legacy. Around the same time, the entertainment industry itself was being reorganized by streaming platforms and by the rise of social media as a measure of a performer's market value. Firth never adapted to that shift. He stayed largely private, avoided cultivating an online following, and did not attempt any kind of public reinvention. He simply continued taking work in films like Empire of Light and in a return to a franchise that had defined an earlier chapter of his career, Bridget Jones. Mad About the Boy. Both reminded audiences that he was still very much present, but presence is not the same thing as commanding the cultural spotlight the way he once did. Then, in 2025, Firth stepped into a role that placed him back at the center of public controversy, though this time it had nothing to do with his own life. He was cast as Dr. Jim Swire in the Sky and Peacock limited series Lockerbie, a search for truth based on Swire's book about his decades-long campaign for answers after his daughter Flora was killed in the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. The bombing killed 270 people, and the series dramatized both the crash itself and Swire's controversial pursuit of a competing theory about who was responsible, including his belief that the man convicted of the bombing, Abdelbasset El-Megrahi, was innocent. The series drew serious criticism from several victims' family groups almost immediately after it aired. Michelle Shula Lipkin, whose father Frank Shula died in the bombing, told The Hollywood Reporter that the show needlessly sensationalized the attack and that its opening episode's graphic recreation of the crash was unnecessarily painful for families who had lived through the real event. She also objected to the series presenting Swire's theory about El-Megrahi's innocence without adequately representing the views of families who disagreed, and raised concerns that promotional material describing the show as a true story could mislead viewers, especially with a related criminal trial still pending in the United States. Victoria Kamak, whose husband John was among those killed, went further, describing the series in a statement as an effort that risked influencing public sentiment ahead of that trial. Sky responded by saying it had consulted extensively with victims' families during production and had labeled episodes for potentially distressing content, while acknowledging the sensitivity of the subject. Firth himself did not step into the public debate over the show's accuracy, leaving that response to the production. It was, in a strange way, another instance of him standing at the emotional center of a difficult, contested story, this time as a performer rather than as the subject of the headlines. Meanwhile, his relationship with his former wife took a shape that few divorced couples manage. In interviews given years after their split, Giugioli has described the two of them as remaining genuinely close, part of what she has called an extended family that includes both of their new partners. She has spoken about her relationship with Scottish climate activist Callum Grieve and described Firth as being on friendly terms with him, in part through a shared devotion to Arsenal Football Club, something she has called a running theme in the family. She has also spoken publicly about her experience with breast cancer, her sustainability work in Umbria, and the closure of the fashion label she once ran. According to Giugioli, the effort to keep the family unified after the divorce was intentional and, by her account, has succeeded. Firth, for his part, has remained almost entirely silent about his own romantic life since the separation, declining to confirm or deny the various rumors that have surfaced over the years. What makes Firth's story land differently than the usual celebrity downfall narrative is that there was no single dramatic collapse to point to. There was no public meltdown, no addiction storyline, no explosive confession that could later be reframed as a redemption arc. What happened to him instead was slower and quieter, a marriage that ended after a long, painful, and partly public dispute, a career that shifted gradually as the industry's attention moved toward younger performers, and, more recently, a professional controversy tied not to his own conduct, but to a real tragedy he chose to help dramatize on screen. None of it destroyed him. He kept working, kept appearing at events, kept giving measured interviews, the same composed presence audiences had always known. But composure is not the same thing as being unaffected, and a life built on restraint does not mean nothing happened underneath it. At 65, Colin Firth's story is not one of scandal or disgrace. It is the story of a very private man absorbing a series of very public difficulties, and doing so, as always, without ever quite letting the audience see the toll it took.